Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
I handed my parents thousands over the years, week after week, convincing myself that it was temporary, that I was simply helping them through a rough patch, that one day they would catch their breath and I would finally be able to keep something for myself. But instead it just became my role, the family banker who was expected to sacrifice without complaint. It started small, at least that is how I remember it, a couple hundred here and there for a bill that was overdue, a car repair that they swore would be the last big one, a medical bill that couldn't wait. And at the time it felt natural because they were my parents, and I wanted to believe that family meant stepping up for one another. I had a decent job, nothing extraordinary but steady, and I figured if I cut back on a few things like dinners out, little luxuries, maybe a vacation I had been dreaming of, then I could give them the cushion they said they desperately needed. The problem is that temporary became permanent, and the requests never stopped. In fact, they grew bolder, shifting from emergencies to conveniences, from "we just need a little help this week" to "you'll transfer it, right?" as if it were my duty. Not a choice, not even something to thank me for. Every Friday, like clockwork, I would send money, and soon it wasn't even them asking, it was me anticipating, opening my banking app, transferring funds before they could remind me, because if I waited, the guilt trip would follow. They would call late at night with heavy sighs, mention how hard things were, how they just couldn't catch a break, and I would cave before the conversation even turned into a plea. What made it harder to swallow was that my siblings gave nothing, not a single dollar, not a token contribution, yet they were the golden children, praised constantly for being busy with their own lives, for not having the same flexibility I supposedly had. My mother would brag about my brother's new gadgets, about my sister's weekend trips, but when it came to me, the one cutting corners and skipping meals out to make sure money was available, there was silence, or worse, judgment that I wasn't settled down enough, that I wasn't doing enough to show I cared. I remember one time pointing out, carefully, that maybe everyone should chip in, and my father just looked at me and said, "They have their own responsibilities. You're the one who can handle it." As though my ability to pay meant I didn't have responsibilities of my own, as though my sacrifices were invisible. Year after year, I kept hoping the recognition would come, that maybe there would be a gesture, a surprise, even just words of appreciation, something to acknowledge that without me they wouldn't have been able to keep things afloat. But instead, what I got was the exact opposite. The moment that crystallized it for me was when I saw photos online, smiling faces in front of a resort pool, cocktails raised, matching outfits for a family trip. I stared at the pictures, confused at first, because I hadn't heard a word about this trip, and then the truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. They had planned it, gone on it, and never even thought to include me. I tried to rationalize it, told myself maybe it was last minute, maybe I had been left out because of logistics, maybe there had been a misunderstanding, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Eventually I asked, and I still remember the way my dad's voice sounded, casual, dismissive, when he said, "We didn't want you there," followed by that laugh, the one that burned into my memory. A laugh that told me I had never really been part of the family celebration at all, just the one funding it from the shadows. He thought it was funny, thought it was some kind of light-hearted jab, but for me it was a slap across the face, a confirmation that my place in the family was useful only when I was opening my wallet. I hung up after that conversation and sat in silence for hours, cycling through every sacrifice I had made, every time I had told myself it was worth it because family comes first. Every time I had let go of something I wanted so they could keep pretending everything was fine. And all I could see was them, laughing without me, living off the money I had given them, mocking me while they sipped drinks I had indirectly paid for. The betrayal wasn't just in being excluded, it was in the way they found amusement in it, in the way they treated me like a fool who would never stop giving. That was when something inside me shifted. I didn't say it out loud, not then, but a quiet decision formed in my mind, and I knew it was irreversible. I wasn't going to beg for a place at their table anymore. I wasn't going to keep being the dependable one they could drain dry while pretending I was invisible. I didn't explode, didn't argue, didn't even cry. I just sat there, phone on the table, their laughter echoing in my ears, and I knew the dynamic had changed forever. And the craziest part? That moment, that laugh, was just the beginning. Because what they didn't know then was that I was already done playing the role they had written for me, and the next move wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And they would never see it coming. When the laughter faded in my ear, I sat there with that flat kind of quiet that feels like it has weight, and because I've spent too many years trying to be reasonable, I actually replayed the call in my head to see if I had misunderstood. If the tone was teasing rather than cruel, if maybe there was a missing joke I simply did not catch, and then I opened the photos again, the pool, the drinks with the fruit on sticks, the caption about family time, and I felt this steady heat move from my chest to my face as it finally landed that the joke, if there ever was one, was me, because I had paid for stability so they could play pretend, and I had done it quietly enough that they forgot there was a person attached to the money. I started listing, not out loud but in that relentless mental scroll that does not let you rest, every deposit I had made on Fridays, every transfer labeled as emergency, every late-night call where the voice on the other end started soft and ended sharp. And because I am not an idiot, I also started noticing the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight, which was that the emergencies arrived like clockwork, almost as dependable as a paycheck. And when someone's crisis fits neatly into a calendar, you can safely stop calling it a crisis and start calling it a plan. So I called back, not because I wanted to salvage anything but because I needed to hear it again without the shock scraping my nerves, and I said I saw the trip and asked why no one told me, and my father, who knows exactly which buttons to press, went breezy and said they wanted it to be relaxing and that I make things tense when money is discussed, and then he said the line that I keep trying to forget, that they did not want me there, and he laughed like we were sharing a story over drinks. Rather than carving me out of a family I have been funding, and in that second I felt something in me snap into place, not a scream, not even a tear, just a clear click like a lock sliding shut from the inside. I told him I heard him, I told him I hoped they enjoyed their time, and I hung up before the next guilt script could start, before he could pivot from arrogance to injury, which is always the second act in these conversations. And I sat very still and let my hands stop shaking. Because I am practical when I am angry, I opened my laptop and went hunting for proof, and the truth is that when you have been the reliable one you leave a trail as clean as a ledger, which I printed and saved because I knew I would need it. Not for a courtroom yet, maybe never, but for myself, to push back when they tried to rewrite the story in a week or a month with the usual lines about how they never asked, how I insisted, how it was always my idea, and as I organized the transfers and the texts into tidy folders, I started to feel my breathing even out and my thoughts sharpen, because if they could laugh at excluding me, then I could certainly stop subsidizing their laughter. I opened my banking app, scrolled to the recurring transfer I had set up during one of those long stretches when they swore things would be better if I just helped them get ahead. And I canceled it with a calm that felt like standing up after being on my knees for too long. Then I removed their accounts from my saved recipients. Then I set up a new savings account and created a rule that swept the exact amount I used to send into that account every Friday, labeled not as family support but as payback to myself, which looked petty on the screen and felt perfect in my bones. I did not announce it with a speech because speeches are oxygen for people who thrive on drama, but I did send a short message that had exactly one sentence and a period. A sentence that said I was stepping back from financial help until further notice, and that any requests should be directed to the siblings who were enjoying the benefits of a trip I helped underwrite. And then I put my phone face down so I would not watch the dots appear. It took them less than an hour to respond with the usual blend of confusion and accusation, and I replied once with the same sentence, a copy and paste that stripped the conversation of bait. After which I stopped answering at all because silence is a tool when you have given people the habit of expecting you to fill every gap. An hour later, a text from my sister arrived, sugar on top and vinegar underneath, suggesting that I was making a scene over nothing and that I should be happy they were finally relaxing, and I typed and deleted a dozen replies. Until I landed on the only truth that mattered, which was that relaxation built on my exhaustion was not relaxation, it was theft with pretty photos. The first little victory came that night when a message from my mother flashed across the screen asking whether I had sent the usual transfer because the card at dinner had been declined and the hotel was making a fuss about a deposit. And everything in me wanted to apologize out of habit, to fix it so no one would be upset, but I let the seconds tick by. I let the discomfort belong to the people who had created it, and I wrote back that I was honoring my father's words, that if I was not welcome, then my money was not welcome either, and I wished them a wonderful trip without me, which was both petty and fair, and it tasted like oxygen after years of stale air. I fell asleep knowing that the next day would bring calls and accusations and maybe bigger threats, and for the first time in years I was ready, because the first move had been made and it was mine, and if they thought I would crawl back because a dinner bill bounced, they were about to learn how quickly a quiet woman can become a locked door they cannot kick down. Morning always used to be my truce with the world, because if I could get through the first coffee without a crisis call, it meant I might get a normal day. But the morning after I cut the transfer and answered my mother with that line about honoring my father's words, I woke up to a phone vibrating in little angry bursts, and while old me would have grabbed it and apologized for the inconvenience like a concierge, new me put it face down and let the noise run out while I stood there listening. Almost clinically, every place my money touched their lives, because that is what you have to do when you finally stop begging for respect and start treating yourself like an adult who is allowed to close doors. And the list was longer than I wanted to admit even to myself, a quiet inventory of favors that had become fixtures, from the cell plan I had agreed to manage during a rough patch that never ended, to the streaming logins they called a family account, as if that word turned my monthly bill into community property, to the roadside service I added when my father's old sedan started dying in winter and somehow never got removed when the sedan was replaced, to the small authorized user card they swore was for emergencies, but used for birthday dinners and golf fees, because those were emergencies too if you asked them at the right time of night. I opened every account like I was walking through a house I had been letting other people live in for free, and I started closing windows and locking doors, not with drama or speeches, but with calm clicks and quiet confirmations, which is how power actually moves when you are done performing patience for people who trade on it. I called the carrier and learned that as the primary I could separate lines or suspend them. And while I did not yank the rug out mid-trip, because I am not interested in stranding anyone in a genuine emergency, I did something more precise and just as educational by scheduling those lines to come off my plan the moment the billing cycle rolled over, which meant the grace they had taken for granted would stop on a date certain and would require them to present a card with their own name on it to keep those phones alive, a small administrative miracle that felt better than any speech I could have delivered. Next, I went to the bank portal and found the tab for authorized users, a tab I had ignored for years because ignoring was easier than admitting I had handed out access like party favors, and I set spending limits to 0. Revoked charge privileges with a box that asked for a reason and gave me a drop-down labeled misuse, which I clicked without shaking, then set alerts that required my approval for any attempted charge from the card numbers tied to their profiles. Not because I wanted to play cat and mouse, but because I wanted a record that showed intent, and nothing shows intent like an attempted swipe after being told the line of credit is not yours. Because I have learned that memory is generous to people who lie with confidence, I printed a clean ledger that captured the transfers, the late-night requests, the text promises that this would be the last time because things were turning around. And I put those pages in a folder labeled with a plain word that made my stomach twist, reimbursement, and I sent a single group email without exclamation points or moral lessons in which I said that going forward all support was paused pending a review of boundaries, and that attached was a summary of the financial help I had provided so we could align on reality, which is a phrase my job trained me to say when what I mean is cut the nonsense. The email went to my parents and my siblings, and I blind copied my aunt, who has always been the only grown-up in the room, because if anyone tried to rewrite what the ledger showed, I wanted a witness who remembered how these stories start before they get softened in retelling. The replies came in a familiar order that used to tear me down, but now just looked like a script finally losing its charm. My father blustering about family and respect while dodging the part where he laughed at excluding me. My mother offering a soft apology with hard edges that blamed stress and menopause and everything but choices. My sister doing that false empathy thing where she said she understood I needed space, and then asked if I could make one exception for this week only because the hotel had a hold, and The card was being fussy, and my brother, who rarely speaks unless he wants something, firing off a line about how money changes people. Which I did not answer because what changes people is being used long enough that self-respect starts sounding like anger to the people who benefited from your silence. Instead of arguing, I made appointments with institutions that do not care about family narratives. And I say appointments because I wanted to sit in front of a person with a name tag and a policy manual rather than argue through a chat window that would log me out if I took too long to choose my words. So I went to the branch and had my banker freeze the autopays and flag my account for any transfer request originating from devices not registered to me. Then I placed a fraud alert on my credit file, not because I believed they would open something in my name, but because I had already seen how casual they were with the cards I had deliberately handed over. And people who are casual with invitations rarely become careful with boundaries until the door hits their shoulder. While I was at it, I called the insurance broker and removed the additional driver permission I had added for a road trip they took last year and never returned to the status it had before, and I updated my renters policy and the spare key situation so that the friendly neighbor who kept my set no longer had standing instructions to let my parents in if I was not home, which was framed as safety when we set it up and had slowly become access on demand. And then I turned to the part that was less administrative and more deliberate, the part that said I would stop playing defense and begin building a case for myself even if the only courtroom it ever saw was the one between my ears. A friend from work who used to be a paralegal told me there is a difference between gifts and support given under explicit representations, and that while I might never want to put a robe between me and my parents, it would be smart to document every instance where I was told something was essential in order to obtain funds that were then used for leisure or status, because a record is not a threat, it is a mirror that refuses to flatter. So I drafted a calm letter that did not roar or threaten, but did request acknowledgement of debt for specific amounts tied to specific misrepresentations. And I set it to send certified on the day after they returned, because I am not cruel enough to interrupt a vacation I already paid for, but I am not generous enough to let them walk back into the usual fog. I also prepared a simple notice to the hotel chain disputing any attempt to place my name on file for incidental holds, because that has happened before when they could not remember which card belonged to which account. And then I opened a small claims portal in my county and discovered that you can fill out almost everything and save it as a draft, a fact that felt like a loaded switch I could choose to flip if the story kept sliding downhill, a fact that let me sleep for the first time in months without holding my breath. By dinner, I had not raised my voice once, I had not begged a single person to see me, and yet the board had shifted under their feet with nothing more than good records and clean boundaries, and while they posted another sunset picture with a caption about gratitude, I sat at my kitchen table and pressed save on a set of documents that would make gratitude mean something measurable for once, which is why when my phone started flashing with calls from unfamiliar numbers and late-night voicemails that sounded like alarms, I let them stack up untouched, because they still thought I was ignoring them out of spite, and they had no idea that I was already filing the papers. I spent that day doing the kind of work that looks boring from the outside and feels like oxygen from the inside, the kind of deliberate housekeeping that people who rely on your chaos never expect you to finish, and I did it without theatrics. No crying voice notes, no dramatic posts, just a calm sequence of actions that started with an email to the hotel chain confirming in writing that I was not an authorizing party for incidentals and that any card with my name was not to be used for holds or backup charges, followed by a call to the bank fraud desk where I asked them to place a real-time flag that required verbal confirmation from me for any charge greater than $50 attempted by the authorized user numbers I had just set to 0. Which meant that the next swipe would ping a human being who would ask a simple question about permission and would record a simple answer, and that record would sit quietly in my corner like a witness who never forgets. After that, I moved through the subscriptions and memberships that bleed you by kindness, the family streaming bundle that somehow became an obligation, the warehouse card where I was the primary and my parents were add-ons who loved to shop midweek when I was working, the roadside assistance plan that was supposed to be temporary until a rough winter passed, the retail accounts where my saved card made checkout a breeze because I had stored it back when I believed convenience was love, and I changed every single One of those by removing their profiles, revoking add-on privileges, and in a few cases setting the accounts to close at the end of the cycle with a final invoice addressed to me alone, because I will not leave messes in my name. Then toggling a little switch in my head that said never again. Because the practical work settles your hands, but not your heart, I did the piece that made my voice steady even in my own kitchen, which was to take the ledger I had printed and add a simple cover page that translated generosity into math without apology. A one-page index of dates and amounts and the words they used to secure them, and I attached that to a letter that did not insult anyone or moralize, but did state in plain language that funds had been provided in reliance on representations of necessity and would be treated as loans unless contested in writing, and I gave them two options that fit neatly on the same line. Either sign the acknowledgement enclosed and choose a very modest repayment schedule beginning in 30 days, or respond with documentation proving that the funds were not misrepresented. And then I paid a process server to deliver those envelopes on the afternoon after their return, because I am not a monster who sends legal paper to a poolside lounger, but I am also not a doormat who waits for the next guilt call before drawing a line, and while I was at it I prepared a second envelope that went to myself. A notarized statement about boundaries that I put in my fireproof box so I could read it when I felt weak and remember that this was not an episode, this was a reset. I knew the phones would start ringing as soon as something bounced. So I set up a boundary that looked small and felt enormous by creating an email rule and a voicemail greeting that said all communication about money needed to be in writing and that I would respond within 2 business days. A line that sounds corporate and cold until you have lived through years of midnight emergencies that disappear at sunrise, and I practiced saying the same sentence out loud until it lost its sting, because people who play hot potato with responsibility rely on you to forget your script first. Then I went to the cell carrier portal and saw the scheduled separation sitting there like a quiet countdown. And I added one more step that felt surgical rather than spiteful by porting my own number out to a different carrier and leaving theirs on the old plan with a hard stop date, which meant that when the cycle ended, the account would not exist to float them one more month by inertia, and if they wanted continuity, they would need to stand in a store and present identification and sign a contract that did not have my name on it anywhere, which is not revenge so much as the absence of indulgence. And sometimes those feel identical to the people who counted on your indulgence. By the time I reached for food, I remembered the spare key that used to live in my mother's purse, because she was nervous about being locked out when she came by unannounced to borrow something or nap on my couch while I was at work. And I drove to the hardware store and changed my locks with a cheerful employee watching because the deadbolt had been sticky for months anyway, and I sent a simple text after the fact saying the spare had been retired and that any visit should be scheduled, which I knew would be read as hostility when it was just adulthood with the lights on. I also emailed my building manager to update my authorized contacts and removed my parents from the list that let them collect packages on my behalf, which they loved to do on days when they were also just in the neighborhood, and I closed the loop by switching my primary checking account to a new bank so that any old routing details saved in their apps would be useless, an extra layer of separation that kept me from living in anxiety about a mistake deposit that would be framed as an accidental convenience, but would actually be a fishing line back into my wallet. I am not naive enough to think paperwork alone changes family, so I did one thing that was not paperwork at all, something I should have done years ago, which was to tell 2 people I trust the unvarnished version of the story and to ask them to hold me to the boundaries I was setting, because there is always a night when you doubt yourself and reach for the old script. And on that night, I wanted a voice that was not mine to say, "Keep going, you are not cruel, you are clear," I told my aunt, because she has eyes like an accountant and a spine like a coach, and I told my closest friend because she knows how quickly I forgive when someone dangles a promise that sounds like love, and between the 2 of them they agreed to be my brakes when the begging started, which meant the next week would not be a solo test of willpower, but a supervised detox from a role I never asked for. When the plane wheels touched down on their return and my phone began to light up with calls that had the cadence of panic and the rhythm of outrage, I was already walking to the door to meet a knock I had scheduled 2 days prior, and when I signed for the delivery and watched the server walk back to his car with the carbon copies tucked into his folder, I felt a steadiness that did not look like victory yet, but sounded exactly like control, which is why when my father's name flashed again and again I did not answer, and instead I opened my laptop and clicked a single button that turned my small claims draft into a filed claim with a timestamp, because if they wanted to talk, they could do it where paper has a memory and laughter does not drown out the truth. By the time their plane touched down and the carousel delivered their matching luggage to the same hands that had waved me off with a laugh, my phone had already collected a choir of voicemails that began as irritation and slid quickly into panic. Because the hotel had attempted to convert its smiling hold into a real charge, the authorized user cards had met a wall that did not negotiate, the cell plan countdown had moved from abstract to immediate, and the banker with the neat handwriting had filed my small claim while I ate dinner and washed the plate, which meant that before anyone even reached their driveway they had a stack of consequences landing like mail. And while the old version of me would have answered on the first ring and tried to make the embarrassment disappear, this version waited until the messages turned into emails and read them in order like pages of a script that had finally been printed on paper instead of rehearsed in my head. My father opened with the voice he saves for getting his way, a mix of amused authority and wounded pride, saying that this had gone far enough and that family does not behave like collection agents, then swerved into the accusation that I had sabotaged their return to normal life over a misunderstanding. While my mother wrote in softer sentences about stress and miscommunication and begged me to pick up because the bank was saying odd things about approvals, and my sister, ever consistent, sent a single line that managed to both validate my need for space and imply that I was ruining everyone's mood over an accounting error, and my brother, who rarely uses punctuation, sent something that boiled down to a dare to come say these things to his face. A dare I ignored because the only face I needed to see was my own in the mirror when I reminded myself why I started. I answered all of them once with a sentence I had practiced, explaining that financial matters would be handled in writing and that any conversation needed to reference the ledger and the acknowledgement they had been served. And then I attached 3 screenshots that did not require commentary, one showing the weekend message where my father called the trip a necessary reset after a hard year and asked for the usual Friday help plus a little extra for emergencies, one showing the bank record where the extra had landed on the very day the resort blew confetti into their drinks, and one showing the fraud team's log of attempted charges while I was being told that everything was fine, which created the sequence my aunt calls the Holy Trinity of accountability because it tells even the friendliest mediator exactly what happened without me narrating it as a tragedy. The next wave of emails came in a different tone because nothing changes a man's pitch like a stamped case number, and my father asked to meet in person at my apartment before this got ugly, to which I replied that the locks had been changed and that any contact needed to be through the address on file, and when he tried to get clever by showing up at my building anyway, the manager followed the instructions I had left and asked him to leave, which he did after calling me dramatic and ungrateful while the elevator closed with the heavy hiss of a stage curtain at the end of a cheap play. When the calendar invite from the clerk arrived with a date and a room number, a date spelled in letters and a room that exists whether anyone thinks it should or not, my mother called my aunt and asked her to talk sense into me. And instead my aunt offered to host a kitchen table meeting in her house where there would be no raised voices and no alcohol and no stories that started with remember when and ended with therefore you owe us, and because my aunt understands leverage without cruelty, she made one rule that turned out to be the only rule that mattered, which was that any apology had to precede any request, and any plan had to be written before anyone left the house, and as strange as it sounds, that single rule drained the room of chaos long enough for the truth to sit down and look around. They arrived in a huddle of excuses. They took seats like defendants who have not yet learned the posture of accountability, and when my father began with his speech about family reputation, my aunt held up a hand and asked for the sentence that would come if there were no audience, and after a long minute he said he was sorry for the laugh, sorry for the words, sorry for letting money make him lazy about gratitude. And the tone was stiff, but the words were clean, which is all I needed to hear to move to the next page. I laid out my terms without shaking, not because I am vindictive, but because I am finally disciplined, explaining that I was not asking for back interest or punishment, only acknowledgement and repair. And that repair meant three things written in full sentences with no loopholes: a signed statement recognizing that funds were provided in reliance on necessity and were misused for leisure, a simple and realistic repayment plan drafted from the ledger with transfers set to begin in 1 month end, to run until the balance returned to zero, and a boundary agreement that removed me from any shared financial tools, keys, contacts, or assumptions, so that the next time someone wanted a reset, they would have to fund it with their own names on the receipts. My sister rolled her eyes. My brother muttered that this was overkill. My father asked if I was happy now, and I said I was not interested in happy, I was interested in fair, and my mother, whose hands had been shaking since she sat down, picked up the pen and wrote her name on the first sheet and then the second, and after a pause my father followed, which is how the room changed temperature without anyone having to raise their voice. As a final step, I told them I would suspend the filed claim the moment the first transfer cleared, not because I was backing down, but because the point had never been to humiliate them in a courthouse. It had been to put these years into a shape that could be seen and then corrected. That night, I went home to a phone that was finally quiet and an inbox with a single message from my sister that surprised me, a line where she admitted that she had envied the way I kept saying no this week and wondered, half angry and half curious, if saying no was a muscle you built or a switch you flipped, and I answered her like a sister instead of a plaintiff, because the truth is I do not want to live in a constant war, and I told her that saying no is practice and policy and that she could start with one small boundary and watch herself survive it, which might be the only useful inheritance our family produces this year. The transfers began on the date we put in writing. The cell lines ended on the day the carrier predicted. The subscriptions stayed closed. The spare key stayed retired. And I kept the folder in the fireproof box not as a threat but as a reminder. Because memory gets generous after a few quiet months, and I want to remember that clarity felt better than approval ever did. When people ask for a neat ending, I shrug and say this is not a movie and no one learns everything in a week. But when I lock my door at night and set my phone on silent, I know the only laugh I hear now is my own when I think about how they called to ask for grace and found a woman who finally understood that grace without boundaries is just a wallet with a bow. And in that understanding I won, not because I punished them, but because I stopped punishing myself.